Right, I'm joined by Damien McNulty, who is a National Executive Member at NASUWT, and we are going to discuss teachers on strike. Now, Damien, to start with, why do teachers in school, what are the problems at the moment in schools? Why are teachers even considering going on strike?
Well, there are huge and almost insurmountable workload issues in many schools, not in every school, but in many schools that are passed down from senior leadership and middle leadership colleagues who feel they need information or work to be done in a particular way, in addition to the teachers who are fully focused on, and rightly so, planning, preparing and assessing for the young people that they have timetable to teach. And really they're at exhaustion levels, and some of the activities that they're asked to undertake, they rightly see as having no tangible purpose, no tangible benefit, or if there is a tangible benefit, that it's not a job for a qualified teacher to do, and they should be allowed to focus on their core job of teaching and learning.
Can you give me an example of one of those tasks or some of those tasks?
Yes, absolutely. Many secondary colleagues will be heads of year, and in the worst examples, we have schools who have form teachers who are required at the end of the school day to follow up any issues that may have arisen with any child in their form class, and that can start at the beginning of the day with not having the correct footwear, and not having perhaps the correct equipment for learning, not having their PE kit, whole range of relatively small items, but essential items for learning in the classroom, and important that the children have, well, certainly the right tools to learn. I'm not really sure that the right footwear is going to be an essential educational piece of equipment. But that then turns into a list of, you need to contact these parents either by sending a text message or an email or both, or actually a phone call. Many parents are alive to the fact that the school number is calling at the end of the day, and they dodge that. So the school put in additional requirements to make contact with a second or third contact person on the list. And that takes, on the face of it, you might think, well, that's perfectly reasonable. That'll only take a few minutes, but a few minutes times 10 or 15 pupils every day with no response that you then have to follow back up. It's a vicious circle. Now there may well be good reasons, and not having the right equipment, for example, pen, pencil, ruler, PE equipment, whatever. But is that the job of a qualified teacher to do? And I think that's the thing that really frustrates, because those teachers are perhaps spending, well, they tell me they spend anywhere between half an hour and an hour most days, potentially engaged in that type of activity, which definitely doesn't require QTS.
Yeah, so that would fall, I guess, under pastoral. What about other issues? I mean, presumably you get complaints about marking still and assessment.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I mean, again, some schools have, well, weird and wonderful marking systems and policies, which often, at their most extreme, are a one-size-fits-all marking policy, which is not subject-specific, isn't age-specific, whether that's in a primary school or a secondary school, and requires a huge amount of teacher attention or teacher time to give children qualitative feedback, even just a few sentences in a book after each lesson. Now, if you teach that lesson each day, if you're a maths or an English teacher in a secondary school or a primary teacher that teaches maths or English, then that becomes a major workload issue. Then, again, in the worst examples, the children are required to give some written feedback, and then the teacher needs to respond to that again. So you're having a written dialogue at the end of almost every lesson you teach. Well, for what purpose? Because the children, the majority of the children don't internalize that written feedback in a way that's going to move their learning on in a transformational manner.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'm guessing also you've got planning. I mean, there's been this huge push on curriculum and kind of particularly for middle leaders, but actually I think it spreads down the chain to everybody. Have you seen any impact with the move with Ofsted towards this whole obsession with curriculum? Have you seen any workload implications on that end of things in terms of the way that's gone?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And that's in spite of the fact that Ofsted have given some very clear messages. We don't need to see an individual teacher's lesson plan. We don't need to see a scheme of work. We don't need to see the detail that sits behind that. Schools actually are requiring, many schools are requiring teachers to produce. What we see, in the worst examples in primary schools are where head teachers require staff to upload their planning every Sunday for each lesson for the following week, which is absolutely horrific. It takes them all weekend to do that. It's absolutely obscene in terms of the amount of work that is required to be done. In secondary schools, again, the worst examples we see are focused on particular subject areas, perhaps because of comments or feedback at the most recent Ofsted report, or a perception that a particular subject isn't high enough up on either the local authority league tables or national league tables, and therefore the curriculum design and curriculum resources need to be reinvented to a horrific degree in terms of detail. And also that the curriculum leaders or class teachers are required to submit their resources and planning across and rightly so. Listen, I mean, there's an element of we all need to differentiate the learning for the children that we have in front of us, but to plan those resources out to the level of detail many employers are requiring is significant. And I think the pandemic's had a really perversely it's ratcheted that up perversely, because as teachers have experienced more absence, not just to do with COVID, but actually mental health issues and other seasonal flu, cold type issues, there's an expectation now in many schools that if you're not there, every single resource that you would have planned and used yourself will be there for someone else to just pick up and use. And that expectation has definitely become higher during the pandemic.
What's been, just briefly, you obviously come into contact with a lot of teachers in your role with NAS. What's been the impact then of all those things on teachers? Are they, have you noticed? I mean, I was speaking to a few actually yesterday, and they were saying this is the worst it's ever been. Now, granted, that teacher was saying that he'd only been in for 3 years, 4 years in the profession. So he was saying, I was saying, well, perhaps it was worse in, I don't know, 2014, 2015, because I said to him, well, the period 2010 to 2015, was that worse, or was that as bad, but you just don't know it? Have people forgotten how bad it was? Or do you think that actually, I mean, first, question A, what's the impact? And B, is it worse, or is it just we're seeing it worse?
Well, the impact is absolutely horrific in terms of the massive increase in our colleagues, our teachers who are experiencing mental health issues. And when I say mental health issues, those present in a number of ways, in terms of lack of sleep, perhaps not taking as much exercise as you might, having more alcohol than perhaps you would normally have just to get to sleep, and diet changes as well, because you don't have as much time potentially to make an ordinary meal, but also emotionally, and those other factors play into physical manifestations over a period of time. It definitely is worse, Tom. It's worse for a whole lot of reasons, and fundamentally it's worse for, I think, three or four key reasons. The first of which is school funding, which has been dramatically reduced over the last 12 years of Tory government, and that in turn, or consequentially, means that the number of teachers, the number of support staff, the number of technicians, the number of pastoral staff that are able to be employed, to be tasked to undertake work in schools has significantly diminished. So the work I described a few minutes ago about teachers having to chase absence or chase children who haven't got the right footwear or the right equipment for school, That wouldn't have been an issue 10 years ago. Teachers wouldn't have been doing that 5 years ago, probably in the vast majority of schools. The task needs to be done, no doubt, but it's now become a task for teachers, not support staff. And things have got worse incrementally and slowly, slowly. So it's the analogy of the frog in the pan of water, where the heat is gradually turned up. And I think any teacher who's been full-time in the classroom for the last 10, 15 years probably couldn't point to one or two or three specific points in time where they would say this event or these events were step changes. It's incremental. And the other thing, Tom, and I chaired on Wednesday night a webinar with the National Head of Education, Darren Northcott, for ECTs, and our colleagues who are coming into the profession now are working like no one has ever worked before as new entrants to the profession. They and their mentors as well, and there will be many of those who listen to your show, are undertaking all of that work effectively. Sorry, the vast majority of our members are telling us, and the mentors as well, that work has been undertaken in their own time in the evenings. It was designed to be undertaken during the school day. So effectively, they're having, many colleagues tell us they're having a repeat of a lot of their teacher training experience in their own time, almost like an open university course that's been bolted on to the end of their professional day. And many of them are absolutely adamant that they want out of teaching and that they're not going to stick with it. They're going to see through the qualification because they've spent time, money,
invested, yeah,
and human capital in gaining that qualification. But many just want to leave the profession and not be constantly working. And I would apologies if this seems like a monologue, Tom, and you did say to be brief, but I'm not having anyone saying, and this is all because of the pandemic, these systemic issues were present before the pandemic. Teacher recruitment and retention is at crisis levels and has been for 7 or 8 years prior to the pandemic, for all the reasons to do with workload. Our members tell us workload's the single biggest issue, not pay, workload.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. In terms of, because what I want to move on to now is this idea of teachers on strike. And the reason this came to my attention is a school that's currently on or staff from a school that are currently on strike in a school near Newcastle. And I thought it would be interesting to talk to you, and obviously on the show that I'm also going to be speaking to 2 other teachers about their views on teacher strikes. But I wondered, just from a logistical point of view, how do teachers organize a strike in a school? Because many of the people on Twitter who replied to me said, how do you go on strike? None of them knew what the mechanisms were or whether anything existed where that could happen.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's governed by any industrial action, and strike action is one element of that, and the most extreme end of industrial action.
Yeah.
So it's all set out in a couple of pieces of legislation, the most recent of which was introduced in 2016, called the Trade Union Act, which you would probably not be surprised to know, as it was introduced by this government, make life even more difficult for any trade union that wishes to take industrial action. It came into effect on the 1st of March 2017. And what that says is, in any workplace, any member of a particular trade union, and if we use NASUWT as an example, must meet 2 thresholds now. And those thresholds are at least 50% of all members of that union must return their ballot paper. And also, of the totality of that membership, at least 40% must be in favour of taking industrial action. There are also time requirements that are set out in law, which mean that to start that process, NASUWT or the trade union in question needs to notify the employer of their intention to take industrial action, informing them of the totality of the number of their members, and also what the nature of that industrial action or trade dispute will be. The school in question that you've mentioned it's about adverse managerial practices, and that's a phrase that covers a whole range of issues, but certainly managerial practices that adversely affect members' work-life balance would be a key element, and it's a general phrase that covers a whole range of items. So during that 2-week period, the trade union will then contact its members and ensure that their postal details are up to date, the contact details are up to date, because the other thing that this government won't let any trade union do is conduct ballots electronically, because of course that would make it easier for people to engage and respond. So we have to engage in postal ballots. At the end of the 2-week notice period to the employer, the ballot will open. We usually, and each union will have its own preference, but we usually allow the ballot to be open for 2 weeks to allow the post to arrive at the member's home address. And as teachers are extremely busy people for all the reasons we've discussed, to allow them to return their ballot, to complete the ballot papers and return them. Once the ballots are returned, the trade union then needs to establish that the thresholds have been met that I've described. And then, and only then, if those 2 thresholds have been met, could we then write to the employer and say, in 2 weeks' time, we will then engage in industrial action, whether that's strike action or action short of strike action, where teachers continue to be in work but withdraw their consent to undertake a range of activities which will be school specific. Typically that could be attending morning briefings, attending meetings after school, supervising children at playtime, a whole range, and it's a shopping list that can be designed in conjunction with the school staff. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
What if there are limited members in unions in the school? I'm guessing that the kind of hands are tied a little bit there. If you're a member of the union in your school, but there's not enough of you to do anything. Well,
I mean, the percentage thresholds remain the same, Tom. So in a 1-4 primary school with perhaps 7 teachers, 2 or 3 of which are NASUWT members, in this example, if 2 of those 3 NASUWT members return their ballot papers, then we would meet the thresholds, and all 3 of those members would be able to undertake action. So I think the point you're perhaps getting to is what happens if there are either colleagues, teachers who aren't in a trade union, which sadly is becoming more common, or perhaps there's a mixed economy of a range of trade unions where there's some of the members are members of NASUWT, some are members of NEU, some are members perhaps of NEHT or ASCL. Then working together with the other trade unions is important, because it's highly likely, certainly for the traditional classroom teacher-based unions, which are NASUWT and NEU, although we have many leadership members and we value their membership, the issues that affect NASUWT members are likely to be affecting NEU members also, and vice versa, of course.
Yeah, so you could join forces with...
Yes, but each union will have its own processes and procedures, notwithstanding what I've explained that's set out in legislation. The process for getting to the point where a trade union will trigger that process, there will be set out in each union's own rules.
What are can you give us examples of singular school strikes that have had a positive impact for staff or achieved goals for staff?
Yes, I can, Tom. And what I'd like to do first of all is to be absolutely clear about industrial action, action short of strike action, and strike action. They aren't the means to the end. They are a means to getting an employer to get into a room and to take seriously the issues that the members are raising. So in many cases, 95% of cases where our members bring serious and significant issues to us, we are able to engage with sensible employers, whether that's head teachers or senior leadership teams, and or representatives from the governing body, or perhaps multi-academy trust if that's applicable. And we can have serious and sensible discussions about what the issues are. And we never have to move to the point where members are so frustrated that there's no change and no tangible benefit as a result of that engagement that we then move to a trade dispute. So if we get to the point where we have a to answer your question about the tangible benefits, often when we move to, and I'm working with one secondary school that you certainly know very well personally, where we move to a ballot process and the members receive the ballot papers. Now, during that period of time, that 2-week notice period, the 2 weeks the members have the ballot papers, in that particular school, the employer absolutely woke up to the fact that this is serious now. This has moved into a different arena, which has serious repercussions for the employer if it becomes known in the wider school community, reputationally. So they genuinely affected change through dialogue with myself. And whenever the ballot result came in, we've got the ballot result and we haven't had to get to the point where we've declared any action because the employer is making sensible choices. So it's a continuum and those levers are there. And those levers are actually only there for 6 months under law. You have to go back out to reballot if after the 6-month period the ballot expires. So other tangible changes, and to be honest, Tom, we never get 100% of what we set out to achieve.
Yeah.
Many of our members think we can have regime change, and in some schools, members will tell us, rightly so, that all of the issues stem from the most senior member of staff, the head teacher or principal, and trade disputes and industrial action in our engagement is never about regime change. It can't be. It's not appropriate to call for someone to lose their job. I mean, that's just not appropriate. It's about affecting those changes. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that. I mean, I was going to ask you about the risks for individual staff who go on strike. And I was going to ask the question, is it, or to at least, threaten to go on strike, let's say, or go on strike, and kind of, is it worth it? Because on Twitter, there's been people saying, well, I went on strike or I threatened to go on strike and then I was, earmarked for, bad treatment down the line and I suffered as a result of that decision. I mean, do they have to, and they were saying that, is there any protection for people who go down this road, or is that just a risk they have to take?
Well, the protection is standing together as fellow trade union members. And if it's one union taking action, it's about all those members being united, because it's all too easy for an employer to pick off an individual. And in real life, if we introduce something like action short of strike action and say, none of our members are attending parents' evenings or after school events, and then fast forward, 2-3 weeks, that action's in place legally, and some of our members attend that, then that very clearly undermines the action and sets some people, a smaller group of people, in a position where they are more open to the abuses of any employer, whether it's in a school or not. An employer has levers that they can apply to their employees. But if staff stand together and are united, then it becomes almost impenetrable for an employer. And often, Tom, from an NASUWT point of view, for sure, we will often start with action short of strike action and use the strike action lever, which disrupts children's education. No teacher wants to take strike action and disrupt any child's education. Teachers are naturally conservative with a small c, and I don't mean politically, but I mean in the strictest sense of the dictionary definition. And we would only ever get to the point where we take strike action if a school attacks one or more of our members because of their engagement in action short of strike action. So that's an escalation for us to protect our members. But it is about members staying united throughout the whole trade dispute. And that's a large part of the message that we deliver as executive members. And that's our key function and role, because we are the people that liaise with our National Action Committee about the initial concerns and strength of feeling with our membership in a school before we would move as a national union to ballot our members. So it's a series of meetings, intense dialogue with the school workplace rep where we have them and members to really understand what the issues are and to assess really the strength of that feeling and how far they would be prepared to go. Because if, at one end, it's a case of, sometimes it's a case of getting into a school, attending a members meeting and hearing members talk about many of the issues that we've discussed tonight. And then whenever I ask what they want to do about that, the silence. Well, and I explain what I've just explained to you and your listeners about the continuum of industrial action. The first step would be, I'd like to write to your head teacher and chair of governors and request a meeting to discuss the issues before we move to any formal action, because at the very least, the employer and the leader of the school require or should be given the opportunity to explain and to answer the points that are put to them. But often it's, oh no, we don't want you to raise those issues, and you think, then, well, what's the point? And what's the point for the members? Well, the other element of this, Tom, I would say, and this goes back to the workload issues, often, and again, before pandemic, but also since, often, me attending that workplace meeting is the first time the staff have actually come together for many years as a group of staff without a senior leadership team member at the front doing a PowerPoint for inset or staff meeting. And it can often be really transformational, because staff will say, oh, I didn't realize that was happening over there in your area of school or your department if it's a secondary school. And because they're far too busy to talk about what the issues are, it often galvanizes a sense of togetherness that has been missing for a number of years. And they realize that actually they've got a momentum as a group of staff where they might be able to, in the first instance, if they don't have a rep, elect a rep and an assistant rep. And actually, as staff members, they feel empowered to go and talk to their senior leadership team about the issues before I or a local secretary would become involved. So, I mean, there are many examples where that happens. And there are far more examples of that happening than there are of strike action happening. That's the extreme end, as I've said.
Yeah. What would you say to people who say they would never, ever go on strike because of the impact on the children? Because some people said that in the replies on Twitter. And I said to them, is there a danger that actually if we don't have teachers in front of the students, then there is no education anyway? But they were saying, we're not doing that, particularly post-COVID. They were saying they would never do it. But does that then undermine other people who would be willing to do it?
Well, listen, I completely understand that position. And, taking strike action, taking strike action does disrupt children's education. But we got to go back to what is the purpose of taking the strike action. And I've said that's the most extreme end of the industrial action that you could take. And it's only to get into the only purpose of taking the strike action is to get the employer to the table to talk. Well,
it's a little bit like, I don't want to, I won't use that analogy actually about weapons of mass destruction, but no, it's a little bit like having a deterrent, which is kind of, to say we are willing to use this deterrent.
We don't want to have to do it.
Yeah,
that's your choice, employer. Yeah. And Tom, those colleagues, and again, I understand and respect their position as individual teachers, to take a position where they say, I would never take strike action. But let's be clear here. If you were a teacher working in a school where you can see colleagues being ground down, whose health is being affected, whose family life is being affected, whose professional life is on a downward spiral in terms of their ability to do the best job they can for the young people, then it's that motivates many of our colleagues in those situations. If that's happened to them personally or to other colleagues around them, to stand up and say, enough is enough, because you know what? The children in this school deserve a teacher who has a life outside the job, who has the ability to function in a way that most other adults in the workplace are able to function, who don't work in education or are teachers. And by doing that, it means that a more well-rounded, rested teacher will have a transformational impact on their ability to provide quality teaching and learning in a way that a teacher who is dragging themselves into work for 7 or 8 in the morning, working all day with the children, trying to do their best job, meeting all sorts of unrealistic and, to be frank, unnecessary workload demands for others in school, that works until 4 or 5 in the evening, does a couple of parents' evenings and inset training during that term, then goes home and does marking and planning until 8, 9 or 10 o'clock at night, puts their life on hold until half term. Are you really telling me that that's something that currently many teachers can do until they reach their normal retirement age for many, which is currently 68? And then once you've reflected on that, tell me, I'll never take a day's strike action, because it's only colleagues that are in those most extreme circumstances where we can't affect change through reasonable professional dialogue that end up taking strike action.
Yeah, and it's sad, isn't it, that we end up even having to have these discussions around that. I mean, interestingly, do you think that, and we're coming towards the end now, but do you think that who is more responsible for this? We talked at the beginning of this about all these different problems, right? And the fact that we still have this retention crisis. It sounds to me from what you're saying that there's a lot of problems still there and a lot of problems still to come. So who is at fault here? Is this about leadership? Is it about Ofsted? Is it about government? Is it about a lack of training for leaders? Is it about how who is at fault here for all this?
Well, let's be clear, Tom, before I come on to answer that. There are good examples of good schools, and I don't mean good in the Ofsted definition of a good school, where staff feel valued, where the children, as a consequence, are getting a broad and balanced curriculum, are really happy, where there isn't major workload issues. So I think what we need to look at is how can some schools do many of the things that, from a trade union point of view, would be big ticks in the box. And we would say that should be the norm. And why is that not possible elsewhere? And I think that's not possible elsewhere because there is, I think, a particular vision and view which permeates about this is what running a school looks like, which comes down to a pretty narrow national training program for head teachers and a fairly constant diet of working with people who think in a similar way. And if you continue to meet with people that have similar views and ways of working as yourself, or have been former successful head teachers or MAT CEOs or former Ofsted inspectors who then say, well, as a consultant, if you buy my services and you do it this way, you're on the road to success because it was a formula that worked for me. And on the face of it, that makes sense. And people will often buy into that, school governing body, school leaders, and you get into that kind of collective mindset then of this is the way it needs to be done, and you're on a particular path. Whereas the most visionary, enlightened, best schools, good schools, don't think in a lateral way. They think in many creative and different ways. I mean, there are a number of schools, for example, that have a no marking policy. Now, that doesn't mean that the teachers sit with their feet up and do the crossword during lessons. What it does mean is that they have a focus on giving children quality oral feedback and engaging with transformational aspects of learning. It means that they look at how school resources that are finite and are getting smaller and smaller in financial terms, how those can be best used. And is it the best use of teacher time to be making those phone calls home, writing those emails to parents? And and it's about having the space to do that as well. And the most precious resource anyone has in a school is their time. And that's a finite resource. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's superb. I mean, you're absolutely spot on. And yeah, like I said, it's sad that we have to have these kind of discussions, that we can't, that we can't have more schools. But you're absolutely right in saying, because I've worked in them, that there are good schools where workload is more manageable, and behavior is good, and decisions are made regularly that take those things into account.
Tom, those schools, there's a common thread in those schools, because I work in one myself, and that is from an adult point of view, and I say that very specifically. I don't mean from a teacher point of view. I mean from an adult point of view. There's mutual respect for all of the work that goes on in a school, from the site manager to the cleaners to the cooks to the office staff to the support staff to the teachers to the senior leadership team, and everyone's voice is respected. So there's a respect there, and things aren't just imposed from on high. Sometimes there need to be, critical decisions made on a short-term basis. Pandemic would be a really good example of that. And because there's mutual professional respect, there's a sense of team that means, you know what, we probably would crawl over broken glass for each other, but not every single time. And if there's some madness comes down the line, we would go the extra mile. But going the extra mile doesn't mean doing 18 or 20-hour days, 7 days a week. And there's a sense of, that professional respect for each other means you see people who might be struggling or having a difficult time, and you say, "Ooh, are you okay? Is there anything that can be done? Have you raised this?" Or, if it needs to be discussed with someone in your line management chain or others aware of it. And you will have that kind of conversation with each other. You'll make time for each other. And I don't just mean professional time, I mean personal time. I mean, have you seen the latest cinema release of whatever? Or spending time together that's not just staff meeting time, spending time having lunch with, a small group of people and talking about your kids or the weather or what your plans are for the summer. There's far too little of that happens in schools these days, far too little of that. And then from that, Tom, if you have that community culture within the adults of a school, then that can't not permeate into classrooms. It can't not permeate into the corridors and into the spaces where the young people work. Because if adults have respect for each other in a way that, if you came into my school, I would say, other than if someone was working in an office that says head teacher on it, you'd be hard pushed to find, you'd be hard pushed to work out who's the head, who's the deputy, who are the assistant heads, because we all dress the same, we all speak the same to the children and any members of staff. There's no obvious hierarchy. There is a hierarchy, of course, but the children then find that the atmosphere in school is more genuine, more relaxed. Doesn't mean that children aren't held accountable for their actions. Of course they are, but we know that we're all capable of making wrong choices and wrong decisions occasionally. None of us get it right all the time. And it's about seeing things through that kind of lens. And that's about the culture and the ethos of a school. And Tom, I know you've worked in many schools and you find yourself in many schools. You don't have to walk very far into a school to pick up the vibe. You know what I mean? I can see you nodding.
I do, yeah.
Absolutely.
I do.
And that comes from, I think, fundamentally understanding human relationships, and it's still more complicated than that, and being mutually respectful. That's it.
Yeah. Damien,
that's the magic.
Yeah, that's it. Damien, fantastic. Thanks very much. I'll just stop the recording.